This is the Wald to Wald Show. I'm Ronnie Wald, going on a solo bid here without Fred Wallen, a very special guest here in South Carolina, which is where the Civil War started. He's near Charleston, and he's also an attorney. Really glad to have Gordon Rhea, who's in, again, Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, on the line. He's an expert on this Battle of the Wilderness, celebrating, or commemorating, if you will, the 150th anniversary. I just interrupted you. Apologize for that, Gordon. But tell us more about, again, this first contest between these two really legendary Civil War military figures, Grant and Lee.
Well, absolutely. As I started to explain, Grant realized that it was necessary to change the way this whole war was being fought. Up to this time, there had been a series of battles. The armies would fight for a couple of days, pull apart, and then months later they go back and fight again. He realized that what was needed was going to be start a big battle and keep going, don't let up the pressure. He also realized that it was time to move all the armies in the eastern and western theaters at the same time, and he also realized that it was important to no longer worry about capturing countryside or territory. What he needed to do was to destroy the Confederate armies. So these campaigns in 1864 are going to be extremely bloody, are going to be constant fighting on all fronts simultaneously, and that's what's going to happen in Virginia. Grant realizes the best way to defeat Lee is to take the Army of the Potomac, double its size, basically bring it up to about 120,000 soldiers and send it against Lee, have another army come into Lee's rear, and have yet another army go down the Shenandoah Valley, cutting off his supplies. So this is going to be concentrated fighting, the type of fighting between big armies that the war had not yet seen. Lee is a very different kind of general. We usually think of Lee as someone who loves to maneuver, somebody who likes to strike out against the enemy, to take the offensive. And again, as this campaign begins, Lee is unable to do that. He lacks his supplies. His army is half the size of the army that Grant will be setting out with. And, of course, he knows there are these other armies that are triangulating him, coming toward him, and he doesn't know if he's going to have to shift to meet them as well. So Lee is pretty much fastened in place at the beginning of this campaign, and it's the Union Army of the Potomac, which Grant will be traveling with, that initiates the campaign through an attempt to maneuver around Lee's army and come in from the side and pull Lee out of his strong entrenchments.
All right, now in terms of, I just wanted to ask you, in terms of the actual battle site, talking about the worst possible place that two armies should come together in a dense woodland where, again, both sides could not even see where they were firing at. A lot of smoke, a lot of haze, a really ugly affair. How did it end up going into that kind of place when you think about classic battlefields out in open spaces? The wilderness was exactly as it's termed, as its name is, a wilderness, and the worst possible place to fight a battle. Is that right?
That's right. As a matter of fact, the worst place for a big army to fight, because Grant's advantage in artillery would be useless because they couldn't see targets. His advantage in cavalry was useless because there were very few roads and trails. And finally, his huge advantage in numbers would be squandered because once a battle line was put together, the troops couldn't even see, more than a few yards on either side, and couldn't tell where they were going. A perfect place for Lee to fight Grant, basically for a small army to hold a big army in place. And that's exactly what Lee hoped to do. He was aided really by the Union commanders. Once the Union Army of the Potomac moved across the Rapidan River onto Lee's side of that river, the Federal planners decided to stop for an afternoon and for an entire night to let their supply wagons catch up. And so they sat there in the wilderness, erroneously believing that Lee couldn't catch up with them. Lee obviously decided immediately to exploit this opportunity and decided to take one heck of a risk. I mean, we think of Lee as a general that loved to take risks, and I think this is probably his boldest move. He broke his army into three parts, already outnumbered 2-1. Two of the parts moved forward on parallel roads and tried to lock the Union Army of the Potomac into the wilderness, while a third part of his army under General Longstreet was to swing below the Union force and up into its underbelly and drive it back across the Rapidan River. Mm-hmm. Risk was very high because if Grant figured out that Lee had divided his army into three parts, Grant could then turn on those divided pieces of Lee's army and destroy them one after the other. So this is the kind of maneuver, if it works, everyone says you're a genius. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't work, they said you should have had that job in the first place.
And there were horrific moments in the Battle of the Wilderness. From my own reading over the years, Bruce Catton recalling that hundreds of men were caught between the lines, and Fires would ignite dead brush, wounded men with gunbees could not crawl away from the coming flames. And soldiers, what the was going to give me on get away through.
That one is out on the old men in the taken basic self. I tried to rescue the wounded and were unable to because they too would be shot down. This was a fight. Bruce Canton described it very well. He said this was like a fight underground with men blindfolded using knives. That was the imagery. A terrible place to go. And when you go to the wilderness today, one thing you'll notice that makes it so different from Gettysburg and Antietam and those other battles is that there are virtually no monuments. The soldiers didn't want to go back there. There were really no celebrations after the Civil War of the Battle of the Wilderness. It was like this thing was so horrible. Was sort of the nightmare of war in the woods that no one wanted to go back.
Gordon, we only have 2 minutes left, and I suggest people go and read your book and get off Amazon or in bookstores, The Battle of the Wilderness, and also you have an incredible article detailing this battle, and also Grant continues to fight for another month, and it leads to almost 90,000 casualties. He would not let up. But one important thing, at the end of the battle, even though Lee gained a tactical victory, strategically it was for the North because, and I know you can recall this better than I can, other Union commanders, when faced off against Lee and when they ended up losing, retreated back to Washington. This time, even though Grant had lost the battle, in effect, he turned and moved on towards Richmond. That was something different, wasn't it?
It certainly was, and I consider that to be a real turning point of the American Civil War. The Union Army was stymied in the wilderness, took horrible casualties. The soldiers were concerned that Grant would do what he had done, what all the other Union generals had done after a big battle, and that is sort of retreat and go back and lick their wounds. Grant didn't think that way. He continued south towards Spotsylvania Courthouse, disengaged from Lee, aiming to take up a position between Lee and Richmond and pull Lee out onto open ground to continue the fight. And that decision of Grant to move south to continue with the campaign was a new thing in the war in Virginia, and the Union soldiers who left accounts who were there say that men threw their hats into the air and shouted with joy because they realized that they finally had a commander who could lead